interpret then the passage that I just quoted, the one that says everyone has free will? How do you interpret that?
You can ask me that question when it's your turn to ask questions, sir.
Darn, I thought it would work. He's good at this.
You said that Calvinists confuse the call of Paul with the call to salvation. As a former Calvinist, could you provide some examples of this from R.C. Sproul, myself? Since I'm the one you're debating this evening, can you show anyone where I have ever made that confusion?
I don't have any quotes available, but I can provide some quotes where I think pointing to Paul and the Damascus Road experience and the effectual nature of his calling is used quite often by Calvinists, and I would be glad to provide those on my podcast at a later time or on my blog if you'd like me to quote those.
That's not what I was asking. Very clearly, I have distinguished between Paul's call to be an apostle and the fact that he was set apart from his mother's womb and recognized that the one demands the other, but we recognize the difference. You say we're conflating them. Is that your argument?
Yes. I believe you think that God is in some ways saving men in the same way that he saves and calls out his apostles because he has a remnant to accomplish his purpose through Israel. And his promise will not fail. So, for example, in Jonah's situation, God could have just used irresistible means to make him want to go, but he uses a big fish. He could have just irresistibly made Paul want to believe and do what he wanted him to do, but he uses a blinding light. And I think we all agree he uses means. But in my perspective, I think that means actually accomplish what the Scriptures say that they accomplish. In other words, the means are unto faith.
But he could have failed. Paul could have said no, yes?
He able but not willing. Calvinists use that term all the time. He's able, but he wasn't willing.
But he could have.
He was able, but not willing.
Okay. So if he had, then God would have had to have found someone else other than Paul.
Well, I'm not denying God's foreknowledge. I'm not denying God's abilities to know what his plans are. And again,
so if God knew, then he couldn't have, right?
I'm sorry?
If God knew, then he couldn't have. Or God's foreknowledge could have been invalidated, right?
Well, God foreknows the free choice. He doesn't foreknow his determination. And that's the distinction philosophically that I really don't want to go down that road. Not because
I can understand that, yeah.
Let William Lane Craig take that one.
He won't do it either. He won't. You said that you can't trust a God who has two wills. God said, "Thou shalt not murder," right?
Correct.
Is that the will of God?
Yes.
In Acts 4:27 and 28, was the early church wrong to pray and to confess that what Herod and Pontius Pilate and the Jews and the Romans did, God's hand and purpose predestined to occur, which was specifically the murder of the only innocent man who has ever lived?
Yeah, I wrote a blog article on this, the three main texts that Calvinists often refer to. Genesis chapter 50, the selling of the brothers. Obviously, Israel being hardened, as Pharaoh was hardened, is a big one. And then again, the crucifixion of Christ. And as I've reminded in my podcast and other places, we do believe God determines some things. God does step into human history, and very similar to what maybe even compatibilistic arguments are in how God works these things out through judicial hardening, that he brings about his purpose. So he blinds the Israelites in order to do what? To ensure the crucifixion. And so, yes, God does determine some things, but it's for a redemptive purpose, like the cop hiding himself. It's for the redemptive plan. It's not to condemn them because they too could be saved. It's not a condemning from birth to death.
Was Herod condemned for his actions in the death of Christ?
I would assume so.
Pontius Pilate?
I would assume so, yes.
Was it eternally God's intention for the cross to take place?
Well, I think the word intention gets misapplied. Because when we say intention, you talk about God having the intention of the evil happening, where I talk about God's redemptive intention in the evil happening. And so there's a distinction. Michael Brown and you go around and around about this too, where God is redeeming an evil for good, and he's taking their evil intention and turning it around. He's redeeming that evil intention for a good thing. And in his meticulous providence, he's able to do that. But in his sovereign abilities, he's able to do that. But that doesn't mean, from my perspective, that we deny human responsibility in the ability to respond and make real choices within time and space.
Let me try that again. Was it God's intention from eternity that the Son of God become incarnate and die upon Calvary's tree? I don't think you answered that question.
Well, I was defining the word intention. And
All right.
yes,
If you'd
right.
like to use, was it his will? Was it the choice of the triune God? Use whatever term you wish. But did God intend in eternity past for the second person of the Trinity to enter into flesh and die upon Calvary's tree?
And that's what I was attempting to answer in saying that proof that God uses determinative, if you want to call them that, determinative means to bring about the redemption of all mankind does not prove that God also uses deterministic means to bring about all the sins that need redeeming. That's my argument, is that sometimes people look at Calvary and they say, well, God used determinative means to bring about Calvary, so he must have brought about all the sin that was being redeemed at Calvary. And that to me is a gross overstatement of what the cross is. The cross is called by Calvinists the worst evil of all time, but the Bible never calls it the evil. The Bible calls it redemption. God is giving up his own life. He's stepping in. He's self-sacrificially giving himself, much like Paul expresses at the beginning of this chapter, willing to sacrifice himself for the sake of his brethren.
That is time. At this time, it's going to be time for Dr. White to come up and give your 12-minute rebuttal. And so you can go ahead and get started.
I am, of course, in a quandary at this point. The debate was to be on the exegesis of Romans chapter 9 and what soteriological system it presented. It is difficult for me to rebut something that was not presented. What we had was a presentation on the subject of total inability and some other related subjects, and then a couple of texts in Romans 9 were then looked at in light of the conclusions that were drawn from other material. And so you do not have two examples of exegesis of Romans 9 to look at. And basically, Professor Flowers said, well, it's only 20 minutes. I know, we both had the same amount of time. And unfortunately, if it comes to asking the question, what does Romans 9 say? Who walked through the text? Who provided a verse-by-verse following of the argument from the preceding context into the end of Romans chapter 9? I think it's rather obvious. Only one side did that. One side has not offered that this evening. So there's not much to rebut. And in fact, my quandary is on a debate level to now allow the topic to be, in essence, hijacked from Romans 9 to the subject of total inability would be inappropriate for me. And besides that, I would have made a complete